Welcome back to Extra Dirt, the podcast designed to help you and your small group put down deeper roots relationally and spiritually. I'd like to encourage you this week to spend some time getting to know one person or maybe a couple in your small group. That is, pick the person that you think you're most likely to really connect with, that you're most likely to really get along with, and have coffee with them or invite them over to dinner, and begin to foster a deeper, closer relationship in a smaller setting with them. What's going to happen is that you learn to trust them and they learn to trust you, and that you learn to know them and be known by them. And so as you come together as a group, you bring that atmosphere with you. So when you sit down with this person or with this couple in your small group and you bring with it this joy of being together and this sense of trust and of transparency with them, it begins to rub off on the rest of your group. So as you can cultivate one relationship, you'll find that in turn cultivates relationships among your group as a whole. Because if you don't get along well with any one of the people in your small group, how are you going to expect the relationships in a larger group setting to go any deeper? So that's your tip for this week. In regard to content, as you're working through this study guide, I feel like there's so much in this passage that I just had to skip over or do very little justice to, just because we don't have hours and hours and hours on a Sunday morning. And so I just want to throw a few of these ideas out for you to think through and to possibly talk through with your small group this week. First of all, and this shows up in the study guide, we have this idea of chronology and what Luke is intended to convey. And without getting into a big discussion, I just want to bring to your mind the idea of genre. And genre is this: if I read the newspaper, I expect certain things out of it. If I read a piece of writing that says "Once Upon a Time," I read it in a totally different way. When I read my science textbook, I read that in a different mindset and with a different understanding of the material versus when I read, so to speak, a novel. C.S. Lewis, The Chronicles of Narnia, for instance. And so as we read Luke, we're not reading Luke as an Americanized biography or as a chronological, in order by time event of everything that Jesus ever said and did. That's not Luke's intent. And so sometimes Luke takes events that happen throughout Jesus' ministry and he rearranges them in order to bring out the theological point that those words are intended to bring. So if we read one account here and then another account here, we don't necessarily have to assume that the one that's recorded first came first in time and the other one later. Luke's goal is not, year one this happened, year two, year three. That's not it. He's trying to convey to us the meaning of Jesus' ministry. And so a lot of times what happens is the meaning of what we read is defined by its context. And so Luke arranges these things so that we read each account in the right context so that we take the right understanding from it. This is why it's really dangerous to just read one verse of Scripture at a time, here and there and the other where, and say what we think it means, because a lot of times we bring our own ideas and our own context to Scripture rather than letting the context of Scripture speak. If you need an example of this gone terribly wrong, just look back in Luke 4 to the beginning, where Jesus is with Satan and Satan is tempting Jesus with Scripture, because he's ripped it out of context and he is using it in a way that it was not intended to be written. Speaking of the way Scripture was intended to be interpreted, the Jews missed the Messiah because they didn't understand Old Testament prophecy, because they read it through a lens that was messed up, that did not properly capture all of what God was saying. In fact, in Luke 24, verses 13 through 27, Jesus is walking down the road with his disciples and he begins to explain to them all the things in the Old Testament that foretold him and that prefigured him, and what all of Scripture had to say concerning him. And their minds were just blown. And I would have loved to have been there, because I think even we miss a ton of it now, and we know who Jesus was and we know what he did. So you can read that account in Luke. That's pretty neat. In terms of what it means to be a slave to sin and the actual redemption that Jesus brought, I'd direct your attention to Romans 6 through 8, which is an incredible passage on this by the Apostle Paul. I won't explain it to you. Read it, let it sink in. Read it again, let it sink in some more. Read it again, do so prayerfully. It's amazing, awesome stuff. I'd like to bring your attention to one more item of note here. and this passage. And that's this. When Jesus reads, he's reading from Isaiah. And what we have recorded here from Jesus is not a word-for-word reading of any place in the book of Isaiah. In fact, it's got a few omissions, and it's got maybe some extra material inserted in there from earlier in Isaiah. And what's happening here is that Jesus, when he went to the synagogue and he preached, he didn't just read 3 verses and say 5 things and leave. It was a much bigger discussion. It was a much longer reading. It was a much more developed exposition that he gave probably. But for the sake of space and for the purpose that Luke is trying to convey here in Jesus' teaching, what Luke has probably done here is condensed some of the reading of Jesus Christ. So if Jesus started in, let's say, Isaiah 58 and read his way through Isaiah 61, he'd have all the material that's here in this reading. And Luke's just saying, here's the important things that I want you to recognize that Jesus fulfilled. Because when Jesus began to explain, hey, this is fulfilled in me, you need to understand that he's fulfilling these parts of this prophecy. It is also conceivable that Jesus did a little bit of cutting pasting himself, but we don't really see a pattern for that in synagogue services everywhere, and so that's a little bit less likely that Jesus said, here's the Old Testament, I'm going to read it with my rendition, with my edits, but rather that Luke later on said, he talked about a lot, here's the important stuff. And so that's why you might not, most of it is from the beginning of Isaiah 61, but some of it is not in there. And you might be wondering, does Jesus have a different Bible than us? But that's probably why. If you want to see all of the content that Jesus likely read, just go back to Isaiah 58 through 61, read it. It's really cool to think of some of that in terms of Jesus Christ. Speaking of which, when we read Old Testament prophecy, it's very helpful for us to think in terms of trajectories. Let's say I had a ball and I threw it and it went from here and it ended up over here. And you say, oh, that's good. You have the ball here and it ended here. But there's a difference between throwing the ball way up in the air and down to here versus throwing a line drive straight across to here. And why is that? Well, let's imagine there's a tree here in the middle between me and the end point. Obviously, I couldn't have thrown the ball through the tree, so I'd have to throw it over. And it would be a different kind of throw, and it would carry with it kind of a different sense. If I said I lobbed the ball to you versus I drilled the ball to you, it's got a very, very different meaning. And so when we look at Old Testament prophecy, we want to understand prophecy in terms of the trajectory that it takes through Scripture. So when Isaiah prophesied this, there were places throughout history where bits and pieces of this prophecy were fleshed out. Because God is always, his character has always been the same, and he has been treating Israel consistently since day one. And so when this prophecy comes about, it's revealed fulfillments, little f, maybe fulfillments of it, along the way as it goes through the air, through time. And then at the end, where it ends up, where this prophecy was intended to direct us to, was Jesus Christ. Was the big F fulfillment, the important one, the real fulfillment, so to speak. But all the little points on the way help us to understand that final fulfillment. And so when we read a prophecy, we don't say, okay, where's the exact day and time that this was fulfilled, that it was that the math equation was balanced, but rather, at what points throughout history did we see this revealed in the way God worked with Israel and redeemed them and showed himself to them, and at what point then did it hit Christ and find its fullest fulfillment, and how are all those related? And so reading through Isaiah then with that same mentality is neat, because you can see throughout history, if you understand what God has been doing, how this has played out, but also when it gets to Jesus, how it meets its real and it's true and its eternal fulfillment. And so that's my little bit for you about prophecy and fulfillment. I owe all of that really to Dr. Van Gemeren at Trinity, great, awesome Old Testament professor. And I hope it helps you in your reading of Old Testament as much as it has helped me. That's all for this week. Have a great small group, and I will see you back here next week.